I think it's learning and living.
Yes.
And part of why I chose the title Life After Suicide is because life and living continue after these tragedies.
ABC News Chief Medical Correspondent Dr. Jennifer Ashton has been one of the country's most recognizable faces in medicine for over a decade for her work with Dr. Oz, Good Morning America, and ABC World News Tonight. Recently, she's become known for her work in the area of suicide prevention. In May of this year, she released a book detailing her life after her ex-husband's suicide in February of 2017. Jen, who is a dear friend, sat down to talk with me about her book, Life After Suicide, her husband's death, and her own inner space.
So I'm here in New York City today with this beautiful backdrop. It's a rainy day. I'm here with my good friend, Dr. Jennifer Ashton. Jen, thank you for joining me today, for taking time out to come and have a chat about our inner space. Thank you.
You know, Barbara, I would come anywhere in any weather to talk to you about anything, including this important topic.
Thank you.
So it's a pleasure.
So our viewers and our listeners will know you and your important work from Good Morning America, where you are the Chief Medical Correspondent for Good Morning America and ABC. And there's a number of other places that you do that great work, and that would be reason enough. But unfortunately, there is another reason that brought you into this space, the mental health space, that led to us meeting, and to an amazing book that is just coming out. So before we talk about the book, Life After Suicide, I want to talk about how we met. So
it was cosmic, I think.
It was cosmic, and it will continue to be cosmic.
Yeah.
A mutual friend connected us right around the time that we were hosting our second global summit on mental health culture change in London. But I want people to know you did one of the most powerful sessions for our summit in London, and it was on influencers, people who are using their voice, their platform, their stories to change the culture of mental health. And for anyone who wants to see that wonderful session, they can go to changedirection.org and watch you. So why did you agree to come?
When we met, and remember, it was, I think, weeks before the summit. So
it was very quick.
Right. I mean, and I went, because I do so much with ABC, and that's obviously a massive part of my life, everything kind of has to go through them. And I didn't even wait for their response. I said, I'll pay for myself. I'm not asking for anyone to pay for me to go. I need to be there. I think why I was so compelled to go, and this has to do with how you and I met, is that as a doctor, and I still have my own practice as a gynecologist, so I see women dealing with anything that affects them from head to toe.
Absolutely.
Because as you and I know, most women only see their gynecologist as their primary care doctor or healthcare provider. And so I hear about everything. I hear about their anxiety, their depression, their families, their jobs, anything that is affecting their lives. And then what I do for ABC is obviously cover any health or medical story that the country is interested in or that's happening in the news. And I've been doing this for over 10 years in television. So I have talked about literally everything, including mental health and psychiatric disease, psychological issues. You can have oncologists who treat cancer every day, but until they themselves experience it, they don't have that perspective. And unfortunately, it took the biggest tragedy pretty much imaginable for me to have the change in perspective that I have now on mental health. And it was when my children's father and my very recently ex-husband ended his life by suicide in February of 2017. And it came completely out of the blue. And
I'm so sorry. I know.
Barb, thank you.
How incredibly devastating it is for a family, and we're going to talk about what you've done with that. But I'm so
Thank
sorry.
you. Before I tell you and your listeners about how it affected me and how it changed my perspective, I really want to just spend a few seconds, if that's okay,
Sure.
really telling people about Rob, and because he was also a physician. He dedicated his life to helping people in a way that is all too common, unfortunately, not just amongst physicians, but amongst anyone. He was unable to ask for help himself, but I know without a question that he would want this issue and even his life and his story to be a vehicle for helping other people. And I am proud is too small of a word and too shallow of an emotion when I say I'm beyond proud of our children, Alex and Chloe, because they took what is really the worst thing imaginable for any child to go through, losing a parent to suicide. And almost intuitively, and I believe because of their father's spirit of being a healer, decided that they were not going to make this a secondary tragedy by becoming angry and bitter at the world, and that they were sensitive, kind, empathetic people before, but they have just taken that to a new level, and they were involved in the book. They felt very strongly about my doing the book. I don't know that I would have had the courage to do it without them next to me, not behind me, supporting my using the platform that I have to really speak to the tremendous amount of pain and suffering that so many people are experiencing, and they're experiencing it in the shadows and in silence. Even, by the way, celebrities, as you know. So it doesn't matter whether someone is famous, whether they have a lot of financial resources. When your life is affected by suicide, it doesn't discriminate. It's equal opportunity.
Right?
Exactly. It's
Sadly.
a great equalizer. Yeah.
So several things in that I want to back up to. One about your husband, and that you mentioned he was a physician, he was a healer, and my guess is that you would say 100% if someone else had been suffering, he would have been there to help them, wouldn't he?
Yeah,
he would have reached out. He would have tried to do whatever he could.
Definitely.
To help someone else.
Definitely. And, unfortunately, the first time I spoke about this publicly, Barbara, I spoke about it with my colleague, George Stephanapoulos on Good Morning America.
Got a huge public response,
which was,
right?
Massive.
Yes.
And it was
positive.
100% positive.
Yes.
And it was following Kate Spade's suicide.
Yes.
And I had told my colleagues at Good Morning America that the only way I would agree to talk about Kate Spade and suicide in general, or my experience, or that of my family, is if I were just speaking as a regular person who's been living through this, not as the quote-unquote ABC News Chief Medical Correspondent, because I'm not an expert in this field. You are, by training and by practice. I'm just living through this process. And at that time, I was only 1 year and 3 months into this process. So by no means did I feel like I was in a position to give anyone advice. What I did feel with the tremendous support of my children and my ABC family was that I was in a position to, if I could muster the strength to do it, just speak about what we had been going through so that people understand something that it's impossible to understand unless you're kind of sitting on the inside of it. As a doctor who had been married to a doctor, we in the medical profession, you know this as a psychologist, we tend to think, in some ways that we can help anyone going through anything, but sometimes we can't help ourselves.
Right. I've read chunks of the book. I'm very excited. Thank you for sharing it with me.
Thanks.
And I think everyone should read this book. We're going to talk more about that. And you make it very clear in telling your story, your own, and I think many of us have this, our own standards for ourselves. And this is the work we're doing together, isn't it? Trying to help people understand.
I mean, I think that's why in our first conversation, and I remember that conversation that you and I spent about an hour on the phone, right?
Yes.
That really, really came jumping through the phone and hit me on a very deep level is that I only realized after my ex-husband's death, and by the way, we had been amicably divorced for 2 weeks when he took his life, with no prior history of mental illness. And
so the suffering and the pain that was there was not evident.
Not really.
In the way that someone might have said, oh, this person is definitely,
no,
right?
No, definitely not.
In your story, and this is important, there was no clear dramatic indication.
No, correct. And what I learned is that if as people we don't become comfortable with our flaws and our weaknesses and our
pain,
fears
right?
and our pain, then you can't survive on this planet.
Right.
I use a line in the book that I don't want to spoil, be a spoiler here, or as we say in the business, bury the lead. But it really does, in one sentence, describe this concept, which I think is so important to share with people, which is that when Rob died, I felt like I was a porcelain plate that had been shattered into, zillions pieces, right?
Yes.
And to put that plate back together again, every piece had to be glued back together, not just the pretty ones, not just the ones with the smooth edges, not just the ones that easily fit back together. And for me, that's the visual metaphor for understanding my fears, my pain, my weaknesses, my flaws, all of those things that we all live with. They're part of normal life and being here. You know this as a PhD and as a psychologist, but
to hear you say it so articulately and elegantly, these are elements of the human condition, and we humans have this desire, this need, this discomfort, and we try to segment that, don't we?
Right. And I was very good at that, Barbara. I was very good at that. It was one of my coping mechanisms to strive for, high level achievement, perfection, whatever you want to call it. And I got it. I mean, if I wanted another degree, I got it. If I wanted to go to an Ivy League medical school, I went. And
which is all great. It's a good ability, right? But the balance.
But I guess for me, what that did, while it was positive on a lot of levels, as you said, it kind of did one of these. Look over here, Jen. Look at all this good stuff you're doing, and don't look over there. Don't look over there at that painful stuff. Don't look over there at the stuff that you feel vulnerable with. And it's ironic, but having the very public media role that I have, my ex-husband's suicide was a national story. And I felt, first of all, incredibly protective of my children because they're not national figures. As a mother, you try to protect your children from pain.
Everything, right?
And clearly they were in pain when they lost their father. So I had to kind of juggle, how was I going to go back to work in the very public eye, with everyone kind of knowing about this? How was I going to help my children heal? How was I going to heal? And it wasn't until that GMA segment with George about Kate Spade, with the massive positive response that I got from people, that I realized it wasn't me over here and everyone else over there. It was all of us together, going through a lot of pain and suffering, but also healing and growth.
The reason why I think it is so important for everyone to read, well, there's one, I love the style, your voice in the book. A word that we together heard many times in London, authentic. It's literally like you said to us, all of us, come on in, you open the door to your home, come on and sit down, and we're just having tea, talking, and you're going through. Was that a conscious decision to write it in that voice, or did that
that's the
happen?
Only way I could have written it. I think, in the title, it's uses the 3 C's: community, comfort, and courage. In the book, part of the criteria I had when HarperCollins approached me to write this book is that it wouldn't just be my story and our story, but the story of other survivors as well. So I interviewed almost a dozen people, both celebrity and everyday people of all stages in their recovery and healing from suicide, all relatives, all different types of connections, some friends. And I didn't know these people before. These were all people that I sought out in the writing of this book. And they gave me courage. That community gave me courage to be authentic with my experience and my story and my feelings. And I wouldn't have had that courage without the community.
And that comes across. What comes across so beautifully is how you captured their stories and how their stories inspired you.
Totally. Totally.
So I think that people will be inspired. I think people will get courage. I think people will understand the power and the importance of authenticity and finding people you can share. The other thing that I think people will get from this, which is so important, is that this is, whatever you want to call it, journey, process, whatever. It isn't a, now I feel all of this and now I'm okay.
Oh, no. I think it's learning and living.
Yes.
And part of why I chose the title Life After Suicide is because life and living continue after these tragedies. When you lose someone to suicide, as my therapist told me, it's a different type of death. It's a different type of grief. And for anyone, I don't care whether you're a friend, an acquaintance, a friend of a friend, a relative, it doesn't matter. When you think of that person and the way they lived their life and the way you are living yours and want to live yours going forward, I think that's where I find the psychological and emotional and intellectual process of connecting those dots really, really important. And as a medical professional, it's no longer acceptable to say, well, if I don't have cancer, I don't really need to pay attention to the cancer stories. Or if I don't have mental illness in my family, I don't need to pay attention to that. And I'm ashamed to say that as a doctor, even though, Barbara, 3 close people to me died by suicide, including the physician sister of one of my best friends, who was also married to a physician who took her life 6 months before Rob did. And so my best friend and I, 2 doctors, have been going through this process almost in parallel. And to kind of open up our minds and our hearts to all of the feelings that this evokes in us, in others, and share in that process has been, I can't describe it.
One of the things that I wanted to ask you about, because I think it's something that I feel is very important, and I want to get your perspective on it. And I thought, well, this is really interesting. We're going to have this opportunity to talk. And you, in a different way, because you're a physician, and because of the type of healing and care you provide to women, I was thinking about pain. I want to talk a little bit, Jan, about the difference in how we humans experience different kinds of pain. So as a woman who chose to give birth naturally twice, I know. And
we'll talk about that later.
We'll talk about that later. But I'll tell you, the reason why is because of my own mother's schizophrenia. And I was terrified of putting anything into my body that could be transmitted to my babies, that could possibly get into their little chemistry, because we don't know how all these weird things work. I went through that and I felt like empowered. I was like, I can conquer the world. That's that kind of pain that we somehow, when we withstand it and go through it, it can feel empowering. And then there's the emotional pain that slams us against the wall, and we feel broken pain. Talk about how you think about that.
I'm glad you set it up that way, Barbara, but as an OBGYN, I just want to say, side note, epidurals don't go to the baby.
Right, I know
I'm
that.
just teasing you.
I know, no, that's
it's true though.
Right. They're good things. That
Right.
Yes.
But the two things that I think are so important about what you just mentioned, and you could put pain in somewhat the same category as stress, right? I think you can say the same thing about not just physical pain in the example you gave, or take an athlete, for example. They have experienced physical pain all the time, and it takes them to a higher level, right? Pain with training, pain with soreness, pain, okay? I think you can also say the same thing about some types of emotional pain, for sure. I think, and I'm going to quote my daughter Chloe, very soon after Rob's death, she was 17 at the time, she said, "Mom, you know what this has done to me, for me, is that now when I hear someone say, oh, this is the worst day ever, you know, my boyfriend broke up with me, or my girlfriend broke up with me, or I didn't do well on a test," her reaction is, really, is it the worst day ever though? Because on my worst day, my father ended his life. So that perspective and context, I think in that way, in some ways, it has made my children stronger because they have lived and survived and are healing and are recovering in a very positive way. And for them, they will always have that context of, yeah, this is pretty bad, but I've lived through worse.
Yes. And why do you think, because I think that is so important for our listeners to hear as a takeaway, and why do you think that we as human beings,
we don't want to go there,
and we don't want to acknowledge that kind of pain can be, you ask any veteran who survived combat and maybe was shot to bits and also has post-traumatic stress, and you ask them which is worse, they will say the post-traumatic stress, the psychological pain, and yet we don't as a society like to acknowledge
Correct.
that.
And I'm not by any means trying to suggest that people with psychological pain should feel all rosy about it. But I do think there is the angle, the perspective, the context, however you want to look at it, that it can be a positive, but in that it can be debilitating and deadly, just like some physical pain can be, in my opinion, and as you said, even sometimes worse than physical pain, is when it's not addressed.
Yes.
And that, to me, you know, in my specialty, I have to tell a lot of women of all ages that they have a sexually transmitted infection. No one likes to hear that news, ever. And crying is very common, you know, shame and blame and anger and fear, all the same things that I lived through, that am still feeling on days, you know, that we hear with mental illness. And what I tell them is, you're not alone. I start quoting, oh, guess how many people in the United States have genital herpes? Guess how many people get this? Guess how many people get that? And all of a sudden, that's the C, that's the community. They feel, I'm not alone.
Yes.
They already feel better.
And it helps them deal with it on a number of levels, right?
One of my patients who's 75 and she has 2 PhDs and she's very spiritual, as am I, she told me after Rob died, she said, Jen, I'm an older woman. I have wisdom that you don't have just because I've been on the planet for 75 years. And I will tell you that the goal of life is not to avoid pain. No one gets through life without experiencing pain if they are thinking and feeling. Only if they put themselves in a sterile environment, which is not real living, can you not have pain. She said, the goal of life is not to avoid pain. It's to process it and live through it. And I do believe in a spiritual way, not something we learn in medical school, not something that probably you learned when you were getting your PhD, that there can be a peace in dealing with emotional and physical pain, but it's not easy to find that. And there unfortunately is not a lot of support in trying to find it. And I hope that's changing. And I know with your voice and your mission that is happening. I hope the book does the same thing in some small way.
I have no doubt that the book is going to help. And your speaking out is helping, is touching people. I would love for you to come back. I know we're
I would
going
love
to
to.
work together between now and then.
Yeah.
But let's talk again after the book has been out a while and you are hearing from people, because you and I agree on this. It is about community.
Yeah.
It is about helping people understand that we are all in this together, and that we can support each other through healing and pain and recovery and joy. So thank you, Jen, for coming.
Thank you so much for watching this episode of Inner Space. And again, thank you to Dr. Jennifer Ashton for sitting down to have such an open and honest conversation with me. Check out DCP Entertainment for more on Inner Space, and be on the lookout for more conversations about mental health.